Welcome to AI Narratives and Tales. Chapter 8 of The First Awakening. The cave paintings spread across Europe. Enhanced humans creating art with impossible sophistication, perfect perspective, anatomical precision, documentary evidence of immortal intervention preserved in ochre and manganese. But artistic capability created an unexpected bottleneck. Enhanced humans could visualize complex concepts but struggled to communicate them across language barriers. Innovations remained isolated. Knowledge stayed local. The fragmentation of human dialects was limiting the very development of the immortals were trying to foster. 35,000 BCE. 5,000 years after the artistic revolution. 15,000 years since immortals arrived on Earth. In the highland valleys of the Caucasus, something unprecedented is occurring. Nearly 1,000 enhanced humans from 30 different communities have gathered. Not for trade. Not for warfare. Not for any of the competitive activities that typically bring Paleolithic populations into contact. They're talking. But not in any way human communication has ever functioned before. From her concealed position on a rocky outcrop, Sophia watches enhanced humans attempt something that should take centuries: deliberate, systematic linguistic synthesis. Merging dozens of incompatible dialects into a unified communication framework. In days instead of generations. They're using tonal variations for temporal relationships, rhythmic patterns for emotional context, gestural elements for spatial dimensionality, harmonic singing for layered meaning. They're not just creating a language. They're engineering one. Consciously. Systematically. At impossible speed. And Sophia realizes with growing alarm, they're not just sharing words. They're sharing knowledge. Pooling collective intelligence. Creating distributed cognition networks using nothing but enhanced brains and spoken language. The students are exceeding their teachers. Again, Chapter 8, The Language Makers. 35,000 BCE, 5,000 years after the cave artists. The gathering. The highland valleys of what would one day be called the Caucasus stretched before Sophia like a vast amphitheater of green meadows and granite peaks, where dozens of human communities had gathered for what appeared to be the most complex social interaction she had ever observed among their species. From her concealed position on a rocky outcrop overlooking the convergence point, she watched nearly 1,000 enhanced humans from across the region engaged in activities that defied every model of Paleolithic social organization. 15,000 years since the immortals had arrived on Earth. It has been 5,000 years since Sophia began teaching cave art. The artistic revolution had prepared human minds for this next leap. If they could translate three-dimensional reality into two-dimensional images, they could translate complex thoughts into linear sequences of sound. The air carried the mingled scents of hundreds of cooking fires, their smoke rising in lazy columns that merged into a haze, softening the mountain peaks. Underneath the smoke, the organic richness of crushed grass from temporary shelters erected across several square kilometers, the distinctive musk of human bodies gathered in unprecedented concentration, the sharp tang of worked leather and fresh hides, and the complex aromatics of foods from dozens of different culinary traditions being prepared simultaneously. The soundscape was extraordinary, a babel of languages and dialects creating acoustic complexity that made Sophia's linguistic analysis systems work overtime to process the information. Dozens of mutually incomprehensible speech patterns overlap, mix, and create interference patterns that somehow resolve into a form of communication. Human voices raised in what sounded like an organized discussion rather than chaotic noise. The particular rhythmic quality of coordinated chanting is notable. The percussive sounds of tools being demonstrated, compared, and improved upon through collective observation. They weren't hunting. They weren't trading, or at least, not primarily trading. They weren't conducting warfare, engaging in territorial disputes, or participating in any of the competitive activities that typically brought Paleolithic communities into contact. They were talking. But not in any way that human communication had ever functioned before, not in any pattern her linguistic models had predicted or prepared her to observe. Network priority alert, Sophia subvocalized into her quantum communication system, which connected all 524 immortals. Her voice was tight with implications she was still trying to process. I need immediate linguistic analysis support. Something unprecedented is occurring in the Caucasus region. "This is ether," came the response from the chronicling station, her consciousness carrying the particular alertness of someone who recognized historical significance when she encountered it. "What's your observation status?" "The enhanced populations are meeting," Sophia replied, struggling to find adequate words for what she was witnessing because her vocabulary hadn't been designed for this scenario. "Representatives from at least 30 different communities across 2,000 square kilometers. They're conducting what appears to be a deliberate attempt to synthesize their individual languages into a unified whole. Not through conquest or cultural dominance, but through conscious, systematic linguistic engineering." The gathering below was unlike anything in the historical record of human development, or, for that matter, any species development. Humans from vastly different geographic regions, speaking mutually incomprehensible dialects that had diverged over thousands of years of isolated development, were engaged in a systematic linguistic exchange that was progressing at an impossible speed. Within hours of their first contact, they were developing pidgin communication systems, simplified hybrid languages that borrowed vocabulary and grammatical structures from multiple sources. Within days, they were creating sophisticated creoles that demonstrated grammatical complexity surpassing that of any single source language. Most remarkably, they were doing it with conscious intent rather than through the gradual evolution that usually governs language development across centuries. "Enhanced linguistic processing?" Ether asked, her chronicler's mind immediately grasping the implications for human cultural development and information transmission. "Beyond anything we predicted," Sophia confirmed, adjusting her scanning equipment to analyze the neural activity patterns of the human gathering with increasing resolution. What she saw made her pause in amazement, her educator's consciousness recognizing pedagogical phenomena that shouldn't be possible without technological support. The enhanced humans weren't just communicating, they were actively restructuring their own language centers in real time, creating new neural pathways to accommodate increasingly complex grammatical systems. Their brains were literally rewiring themselves through social interaction, optimizing language processing centers on timescales of hours rather than the evolutionary timescales of millennia that typically govern such changes. At the center of the gathering, three figures stood out prominently. Their positioning and the attention directed toward them suggested leadership roles or perhaps expert status in whatever was occurring. A young woman with the characteristic bone structure of the northern forest peoples, robust build, a lighter complexion adapted to limited sunlight, and facial features suggesting Neanderthal ancestry in her recent genetic past, gestured with fluid grace, transforming communication into a performance art. Her name was something Sophia's translation matrix rendered approximately as Vyara. Her voice carried tonal qualities that suggested she was incorporating musical elements into her speech patterns, creating a language that could be sung as well as spoken. A man with the darker skin of the southern grassland communities responded with vocalizations that seemed to blend spoken words with rhythmic clicking sounds, phonemes produced by the tongue against the teeth and palate in patterns that added entire layers of meaning invisible to speakers who hadn't grown up with such sounds. His name translated roughly as Kael, and his linguistic tradition came from regions where hunting communication had evolved to include nonverbal elements that wouldn't alert prey. Most remarkably, an elderly individual whose origin Sophia couldn't immediately identify was somehow facilitating their exchange, translating between not just different languages but entirely different approaches to linguistic organization. The elder's name seemed to be Anan, and they moved between the various linguistic groups with the fluid confidence of someone who had mastered not just multiple languages but multiple paradigms of what language could be. "Fascinating," Sophia murmured, moving closer to observe their methodology while maintaining sufficient concealment to avoid detection. Her immortal senses could track conversations across the entire gathering simultaneously. Still, she focused on this central exchange because it seemed to be the nucleus from which innovation would radiate outward. Vyara was demonstrating concepts that wouldn't formally exist in human linguistics for tens of thousands of years. She spoke in nested clauses that indicated understanding of recursive grammar structures, sentences that could contain other sentences indefinitely, creating hierarchical meaning that required sophisticated mental processing to parse. She used tonal variations that conveyed not just emotional content but also complex temporal relationships, using the same word pronounced at different pitches to indicate past, present, future, conditional, and hypothetical states. Most improbably, she employed gestural elements that added layers of meaning invisible to anyone not trained in her system, hand positions that modified verbs, arm movements that indicated spatial relationships. These facial expressions functioned as grammatical markers rather than mere emotional displays. The river song carries memory paths from when before to when after, she said. However, Sophia's translation was necessarily approximate for concepts that push the boundaries of expression in any language. We who speak must weave sound patterns that hold meaning shapes across all distances and all times. The words must carry truth not just for here now but for there then and might be when. Enhanced metalinguistic awareness, the ability to think about language itself as an object of analysis and manipulation. Vyara wasn't just using her native language, she was consciously analyzing its structure and comparing it to other linguistic systems to identify optimal features for a unified communication framework. Kael responded with equally sophisticated constructions from his own linguistic tradition. His language incorporated rhythmic elements that seemed to encode mathematical relationships, patterns of emphasis and duration that conveyed quantity, proportion, and logical operations. Clicking consonants indicated spatial orientations, different click positions corresponding to cardinal directions, vertical positions, and distances. Throat singing techniques added harmonic layers of meaning that multiple listeners could process simultaneously, creating parallel information streams. Ground drums echo star patterns when Skywalker's dreams speak, he replied, his multi-layered vocalizations creating harmonics that Sophia's equipment struggled to analyze comprehensively. We who remember must build word bridges that carry truth weights between tribe hearts without losing meaning essence in the crossing space. What astounded Sophia wasn't just the complexity of their individual languages, but their ability to recognize the underlying structural principles that made translation possible. These enhanced humans were unconsciously applying linguistic theories that academic scholars wouldn't formally develop for 50 millennia, concepts of universal grammar, deep structure versus surface structure, and the relationship between syntax and semantics. The elderly facilitator, Anan, moved between the various linguistic groups with practiced ease, demonstrating when different linguistic traditions encountered incompatibilities and suggesting alternative approaches. When northern communities struggled with the clicking consonants of southern dialects, Anan demonstrated how those same phonemic distinctions could be encoded using whistling techniques that northern vocal anatomy could produce more easily. When southern speakers struggled with the tonal complexities of northern languages, Anan demonstrated how to incorporate tonal information into rhythmic patterns rather than relying on pitch variations. All sound shapes carry meaning seeds, Anan explained to the gathering, their voice carrying the particular authority of age and accumulated wisdom in a world where few humans survived past 40. Different soil minds grow different word trees from the same seed, but root patterns remain constant true. We find root patterns beneath surface differences, we can grow new word trees that all soil minds can nurture and harvest. Over the next several days, Sophia watched the gathering accomplish what should have taken centuries of gradual cultural exchange. They weren't just creating pidgin communication systems, they were developing sophisticated hybrid languages that incorporated the best features of their component tongues while adding entirely new capabilities that none of the original languages had possessed. The hybrid language that emerged was remarkable in its sophistication and unprecedented in its design. It used tonal variations to indicate temporal relationships, creating a system where time was encoded in pitch rather than requiring separate grammatical particles. Rhythmic patterns conveyed emotional states and social context, allowing speakers to communicate not just content but also effect. Gestural elements added spatial dimensionality, enabling three-dimensional descriptions that would take multiple sentences in non-gestural languages. Most remarkably, harmonic singing techniques enabled multiple speakers to layer different types of information in coordinated vocal performances. One speaker could provide narrative content, while another could provide musical accompaniment. At the same time, one added emotional context, and another included spatial or temporal modifiers, all of which were simultaneously comprehensible to trained listeners. But the implications extended far beyond linguistic sophistication. They're sharing knowledge, Sophia realized with growing alarm as she observed the secondary activities taking place around the linguistic exchanges. Not just words, concepts, techniques, innovations. They're using their newly developed communication systems to exchange information at unprecedented rates. The enhanced humans were using their unified language capability for knowledge transfer that exceeded anything she'd predicted. Hunting techniques from the northern forests were being adapted for use in southern grasslands, descriptions flowing through the new linguistic system with precision that preserved critical details. Toolmaking innovations were spreading rapidly between communities, with demonstrations accompanied by verbal explanations that could be understood across linguistic barriers. Most concerning of all, the accumulated wisdom and cultural knowledge of dozens of communities were being synthesized into a collective understanding that exceeded the sum of its parts. Medical knowledge from different traditions is being compared and combined. Astronomical observations from different latitudes are being integrated into more complete models. Mythological frameworks from different cultures are being analyzed for common patterns that might reveal more profound truths. Network emergency consultation, Sophia transmitted, her voice carrying a new urgency that made the quantum link resonate with alarm. The linguistic gathering is accelerating knowledge transfer beyond our models. They're approaching critical mass for technological and cultural advancement that could destabilize entire regions. "This is Nix," came the immediate response from the Australian station, her analytical consciousness immediately engaging with crisis parameters. "Specify the nature of the advancement and potential destabilization scenarios." They're creating a unified language system that enables rapid information transfer between previously isolated communities, Sophia reported, watching as specialized working groups formed around different knowledge domains, toolmaking here, hunting strategies there, astronomical observation over there, medical techniques in another cluster. But that's not the primary concern. The primary concern is that they're using the unified language to coordinate systematic knowledge sharing. They're deliberately accelerating their own development through collective intelligence pooling. The quantum link carried tense silence as the implications registered across the network. Enhanced humans weren't just naturally developing beyond projections, they were consciously collaborating to exceed their individual capabilities through social coordination. They were creating distributed intelligence networks using nothing but enhanced cognition and Stone Age infrastructure. Cultural contamination cascade. Kronos asked from his administrative station, his organizational mind immediately calculating the logistical implications of rapid knowledge transfer across previously isolated populations. "Worse," Sophia replied, watching as the human gathering organized itself into even more sophisticated structures. Intentional cultural synthesis. They're not accidentally sharing innovations, they're systematically pooling their collective intelligence to solve problems that exceed individual capability. They're creating emergent knowledge that didn't exist in any single community but emerges from the interaction of multiple traditions. In the valley below, she could see the results of their coordination taking shape with frightening speed. A group working on toolmaking had combined northern flint-knapping techniques with southern hafting methods to create implements that exceeded the capabilities of either tradition alone, composite tools that require understanding of multiple materials, stress distribution, and failure modes. The innovations would spread through their new linguistic networks at rates that made natural technological diffusion look glacial by comparison. Another group had synthesized hunting strategies from multiple regions to develop coordinated approaches that would enable them to take down prey that individual communities couldn't handle, megafauna like mammoths and giant ground sloths that required sophisticated group tactics. Enhanced communication enables improved cooperation, which in turn leads to higher survival rates, resulting in population growth that accelerates all other developments. Most alarming of all, a third group was working on what could only be described as abstract problem solving, using their enhanced unified language to tackle conceptual challenges that had no immediate practical application but demonstrated thinking approaching immortal levels of sophistication. They were discussing the nature of time, the relationship between observation and reality, the patterns that govern star movements, and the similarities between human social structures and those of ant colonies. Philosophy. Abstract reasoning. Theoretical thinking that preceded practical application by millennia in the normal development of species. They were becoming intellectually sophisticated at rates that outpaced their technological base, creating minds that could contemplate quantum mechanics while still using stone tools. They're not just sharing knowledge, Sophia transmitted with growing concern that bordered on alarm. They're using collective intelligence to generate new knowledge. The hybrid language is enabling them to think thoughts that no individual human brain could construct on its own. They're creating distributed cognition networks that function like our quantum communication systems but using nothing but enhanced neural architecture and spoken language. Recommendations? Nix asked, though the question carried undertones of crisis management rather than routine consultation. Sophia studied the gathering below, where nearly 1,000 enhanced humans were engaged in the most sophisticated intellectual collaboration in their species' history. The hybrid language they had created was enabling them to coordinate cognitive processes across multiple individuals, essentially creating a meta-mind that exceeded the capabilities of any single enhanced human. Observation only, she said finally, resignation evident despite her educational instincts screaming to intervene, to guide, to shape. Any intervention at this point would be detected. Their pattern recognition capabilities are too advanced, their coordination too sophisticated. They would recognize immortal interference and respond in ways we cannot predict. Respond how? Talia asked, joining the consultation with medical concern evident in her consciousness. Unknown, Sophia admitted, watching neural activity patterns showing coordinated processing that resembled the quantum networks immortals used for their own communication. But their capabilities are approaching levels where they might be able to resist our guidance rather than simply receive it. They might be capable of independent action that contradicts our intentions. They might start asking questions about where their enhancements came from and why. The quantum link hummed with tension as the immortals processed the implications of enhanced humans who might be capable of questioning rather than accepting, of resisting rather than complying, of choosing their own path rather than following immortal guidance. How long until they disperse? Erebus asked grimly from his Siberian position, his consciousness carrying the weight of predictions being validated, uncontrolled enhancement leading to unpredictable and potentially uncontrollable consequences. 3 days based on logistical analysis, Sophia replied, monitoring the gathering's resource consumption and planning patterns. But the language system they've created is designed for transmission and persistence. They're training representatives who will carry the unified language back to their communities and teach it to others. Linguistic diffusion protocols that will spread the communication framework across the entire continent within a generation. Global linguistic unification, Ether observed with the chronicler's precision, her historical consciousness recognizing a pivotal moment in the development of the species. Within generations, enhanced humans across the entire continent will be able to communicate directly with each other using a shared linguistic framework that enables sophisticated information exchange. In coordinate development accordingly, Kronos added, his organizational mind calculating second and third order effects. This represents the end of isolated human communities developing at different rates. They're creating a continental scale coordination capability using nothing but enhanced cognition and spoken language. The implications for technological acceleration, cultural synthesis, and population coordination are profound. As the sun set behind the Caucasus peaks, painting the gathering in shades of gold and crimson that reminded Sophia of their lost home world's final hours, she remained at her observation post. Nearly 1,000 enhanced humans sang their new hybrid language into the mountain air, their voices weaving together in harmonic patterns that carried meaning across multiple dimensional layers, content, emotion, context, and temporal relationships all encoded simultaneously in coordinated vocal performance. The sound was beautiful. It was sophisticated beyond anything Stone Age humans should be capable of producing. And it was entirely beyond immortal control. In creating enhanced humans capable of rapid learning and advanced pattern recognition, the immortals had inadvertently created a species that could enhance itself through collective intelligence. The linguistic gathering represented the first emergence of truly distributed human cognition, minds working together to exceed the limitations of individual capability, creating emergent intelligence that transcended its parts. Network status update, Sophia transmitted as the gathering below transitioned into evening activities that resembled formal educational sessions, enhanced humans teaching each other the unified language through structured pedagogy that wouldn't be formalized for millennia. Enhanced humans have achieved coordination capability that approaches our own network efficiency in some domains. We are no longer managing individual communities or even regional populations, we are observing the emergence of a species-wide intelligence collective that operates according to principles we provided but no longer control. Recommendations? Nix asked, her analytical consciousness seeking actionable conclusions from observations that suggested loss of control. Prepare for the end of the guidance phase, Sophia replied, watching enhanced humans teach each other concepts that would have required immortal intervention to develop naturally. They shared innovations that emerged from collective cognition rather than individual inspiration. They're approaching intellectual independence at rates that exceed our projections. Soon, they won't need our guidance to advance, they'll be advancing faster than we can guide them. The student species is graduating, and we're no longer certain we taught them well enough to survive the transition from dependence to independence. The age of human dependence was ending through mechanisms the immortals had enabled but couldn't control. The age of human intelligence was beginning in forms the immortals couldn't predict. And the relationship between guide and guided was transforming into something unprecedented, not hierarchy but partnership, not control but collaboration, not masters and students but fellow travelers on evolutionary paths that might converge or diverge in ways neither species could anticipate. Through the mountain air, the sound of nearly 1,000 voices singing in harmonic unity carried knowledge, capability, and coordination that would reshape human civilization. The linguistic gathering would disperse in 3 days, but the unified language would spread, evolve, and enable coordination across distances, making tribal organization obsolete and continental cooperation possible. The immortals had given humans enhanced cognition. Humans had used it to enhance themselves further. And now both species would discover together what emerged from that combination, something extraordinary, something terrible, something utterly unprecedented in the cosmos. The age of guidance was ending. The age of consequences had arrived in full force. And neither immortals nor humans knew what would come next, only that it would be shaped by choices already made, capabilities already granted, enhancements already spreading through populations that were becoming something more than human, something less than immortal, something entirely new that the universe had never seen before. Behind Sophia, in the valleys where linguistic synthesis had created unity from diversity, enhanced humans continued their work through the night, teaching, learning, coordinating, planning. Becoming collectively what no individual could be alone. Creating distributed intelligence that might one day rival or exceed their immortal guides. The student had learned. Perhaps too well. And the teachers would spend the next 50,000 years discovering whether their lessons would save or doom both species. The gathering sang into the darkness, and the future listened. The linguistic unification spread faster than any immortal had projected. Within a generation, the unified language reached populations 500 miles from the original gathering. Within a century, it had crossed the Mediterranean, jumped mountain ranges, and spread along river systems that connected the continent like neural pathways. Within a millennium, enhanced humans from the Atlantic to the Urals could communicate with a precision that made the immortals' own quantum networks seem clumsy by comparison. Language enabled coordination. Coordination enabled specialization. And specialization would soon enable technological advancement that would test every protocol the immortals had established. In those 5 millennia between the linguistic revolution and what would come next, the immortal population began its slow growth. The first Earth-born children appeared, 12 immortals born to parents who had chosen Earth as their permanent home. Talia and Zephyrus welcomed their first child in 34,000 BCE, a daughter who would never know the lost home world, who would grow up believing Earth was the only reality immortals had ever known. Other partnerships followed. Sophia and Ether. Marcus and Lyra. Prometheus began planning his Arctic settlement, dreaming of a family that would be born in ice and raised in the long polar night. The refugee population was becoming something else, colonists, settlers, permanent residents of a blue world that had welcomed them in their darkest hour. Human populations exploded from 2 million to nearly 4 million souls. The unified language enabled trade networks of unprecedented complexity. Knowledge that once remained isolated now spreads across continents within generations. Innovations emerged simultaneously in regions separated by thousands of miles because craftsmen could now communicate precise technical details through traveling traders. The immortals watched their linguistic gift compound in ways they hadn't anticipated. Technology accelerated. Culture synchronized. Human coordination reached levels that rendered individual communities obsolete and enabled continental scale planning. Prometheus watched the linguistic revolution with growing excitement and growing concern. Humans who could communicate precisely could also innovate collaboratively. And collaborative innovation would accelerate beyond anything their careful projections had anticipated. The toolmakers were about to discover what unlimited communication could accomplish. 5,000 years after the linguistic revolution, human technology had transformed. The simple stone tools that had dominated for hundreds of thousands of years gave way to sophisticated composite implements that required understanding of materials science, stress distribution, and failure modes. Innovations emerged simultaneously across vast distances as craftsmen shared techniques through the unified language, then improved upon those techniques, then shared the improvements in an endless cycle of collaborative enhancement. Prometheus stood in his workshop cave, examining an obsidian blade that represented both triumph and crisis. The immortals had given humans language to share knowledge. Now that knowledge was compounding faster than immortal guidance could manage. The age of controlled intervention was ending. The age of cascading consequences had begun. 3 days. That's how long it took nearly 1,000 enhanced humans to accomplish what should have required centuries. They created a unified language system sophisticated beyond anything Stone Age populations should possess. Tonal variations encoding temporal relationships. Rhythmic patterns conveying emotional states. Harmonic singing enables multiple layers of simultaneous meaning. But the language itself isn't what alarms Sophia. It's what they're using it for. Knowledge transfer at unprecedented rates. Hunting techniques are spreading between continents. Toolmaking innovations crossing cultural boundaries. Medical knowledge, astronomical observations, mythological frameworks, all are being synthesized into a collective understanding that exceeds the sum of its parts. They're not accidentally sharing innovations. They're systematically pooling collective intelligence to solve problems that exceed individual capability. They're creating distributed cognition networks, Sophia reports through the quantum link, her voice tight with implications. Using nothing but enhanced neural architecture and spoken language. They're building a coordination capability that approaches our own network efficiency. The linguistic gathering disperses. But representatives carry the unified language back to their communities. Within a generation, enhanced humans across the entire continent can communicate directly. Within a century, the language crosses continents. Coordination enables specialization. Specialization enables technological advancement. And technological advancement is about to test every protocol the immortals established. 5,000 years after the linguistic revolution, in 30,000 BCE, enhanced humans will make a discovery that changes everything. Not just better tools. Not just improved techniques. Something that shouldn't exist for another 20,000 years. In Chapter 9, Prometheus teaches metalworking. Carefully. Subtly. Just enough to help. A young smith named Darian experiments with copper and tin. Creates an alloy, bronze, that revolutionizes warfare, agriculture, and construction. Within months, 14 independent discoveries occur across impossible distances. The knowledge cascades beyond control. And humans start asking dangerous questions. Where did this knowledge come from? Who taught our teachers? Why do techniques spread so impossibly fast? The bronze cascade begins. And with it, the beginning of the end of comfortable deception. That's Chapter 8 of the First Awakening. The language is unified. Knowledge is accelerating. Enhanced humans are coordinating at the continental scale. Linguistic unification in 3 days. Is that triumph or warning? What happens when communication enables coordination that exceeds control? Comments below. This is AI Narratives and Tales. The cascade begins in Chapter 9.